Hey everybody, welcome to Drive Thru Review 698. Today we're going to review Seastead. Now this is the first of two videos coming out today. This is a two-player game of a game that came out earlier in the year called Flotilla. And the next review is going to be a game called Curious Cargo, which is a two-player version of a game called Pipeline. So a little bit of a theme this week. So today we're talking about Seastead. It's two players. It's set in the same kind of universe as Flotilla, which is basically like the old movie Waterworld with Kevin Costner, sort of post-apocalyptic Mad Max, but on the water. So this loosely. So this is got some similar ideas to Flotilla, but it's not definitely like a one-to-one representation of the ideas in Flotilla that have been moved into Seastead. It's kind of in the same vibe. So let's go ahead and jump in and take a look at it, and then I'll tell you what I think. So similar to Flotilla, the idea of the game is that you're going to be kind of deep sea diving for various different resources and then bringing them back up to sort of this makeshift humanity, kind of on these floating cities that are trying to help humanity recover from the brink. Now there's two main areas of focus in Seastead, and the first one is each player has their own player board. Here we can see the teal players, and has various different buildings on it, shipyards, academies, ports, as well as off to the side you'll have some ships which are built of course by the shipyards. And in the center of the table, you'll have four of these large hexagons. These are these large floating cities, and these are double-sided, so they'll have A and B sides. They recommend playing with all A sides for your first game, and I would definitely endorse that recommendation. But you can play either A or B or do a mix and match. So your core thrust of the game is going to be building these buildings from your player board onto these different floating cities. And which buildings you put where adjacent to which buildings of yours or your opponents is really going to factor in to the game. And there might be discounts and things like that, or special abilities on the different spaces on these boards that are going to give you incentives in terms of where and when you should build in various places. Now the resources that you spend to actually put these buildings out are going to be randomly distributed at the start of the game, with one of those resources being flipped over with a little lock icon that you can see here, and that is the resource that that particular city is going to require for you to be able to kind of set up shop there. Now on your turn you have two simple choices. You're either going to do a dive action where you're going to go and collect resources, or you're going to do a build action, which is to build and put out those various different buildings. Now the dive action is very simple. You're simply going to flip up a card from this dive deck and then orient it between you and your opponent, and then each side is just going to collect the resources indicated. So in this case, the player on the left would collect any resource of their choice, and the player on the right would get two of the blue fish resources. And the build action is similarly very simple as well. So you can see here, this particular city wants these gray metal resources. So the red player could, if they wish, pay two resources indicated by the spot here and build a port there. However, you can see off to the right, this space also costs two resources, but it actually has a discount if you're building the port, which you can see there, and it only costs you one less resource, or in this case, one resource. And you can also see, if we zoom in a little bit here, each of these spaces usually has a little special ability that will trigger when you build there. So what this icon here means, for example, is you can take any resource if you want when you build a building here, as long as it's different than the resource that you use to build. Whereas this icon here allows you to take one resource token from the supply that does not match what you used to spend, but per each shipyard located on this tile. And there's a nice handy reference on the back of the rulebook to decipher all of those icons. Now, in addition to triggering the special ability of the space where you built, you're also going to trigger the special ability of what you actually built. So if you built a shipyard, you'll trigger one thing versus if you built a port and so on. And then you might also unlock some other abilities. So if we take a look at this uncovered player board here, you can see underneath all of the spaces where the buildings are, it shows you a little icon to kind of remind you that, hey, when you build a shipyard, you're going to do the shipyard action. When you build an academy, you're going to do academy action. Now, when you clear off an entire row or you build all of the buildings of that type, you're going to get a bonus action. And this is what's known as the row bonus. So for example, once you build all your shipyards, then you can rearrange all your ships as you wish. Or if you build your last academy, then you can unflip maybe a used specialist and so on, which we'll get into in a minute. Now there's also a column bonus. So once you build one of each type, then that will allow you to rearrange the resources on the cities. So you remember at the beginning we had one resource that was locked. So you can rearrange any of the other three, you can swap 2 of those and then unlock the one that was locked and then lock one of the others. So you kind of will lock in place what resources that a particular city is demanding at any given time, but then that can be flipped around. So it becomes prevents sort of a snowball effect to say, oh, well, I just keep getting all these resources and then comboing off of that, and then I can just fill up this one city really quickly. It allows you to kind of get around that a little bit and play with that a little bit. So let's walk through quickly what all of the different buildings do. When you build a shipyard, you can put out one of your ships. You can put it on any of these different flotillas. You always have to put it in kind of the cheapest spot that doesn't already have a building. And while it's there, it actually reduces the cost to build buildings there for both players. And then once a building is built there, then that ship can move off to another spot. The next thing you could build here is a port. And when you build that, you get to select one of 3 face-up port tiles and place it adjacent to your port. And you'll attach these to your port, and these are going to give you bonus points at the end of the game, either to yourself or your opponent. So if you look at this here, kind of moving from the bottom to the top, you're going to get extra points at the end of the game for having the indicated resource. And then buildings adjacent to it to the left and the right in that second row are going to score a point for whoever builds it. So in this case, whoever built an academy to the left or right will get a point, even if it's your opponent. And then to the space adjacent to that on the top row, you get 2 points for having built a shipyard. And it's worth noting that you can also activate that bottom section of the port whenever you activate the row bonus for the ports when you build your last port. Finally, we got the academy. When you build the academy, you'll be able to select one of 3 specialist cards and put that in front of you. And these all come with a special ability. These are worth a victory point if you don't spend them or if you somehow untap them. Because once you spend them, you flip them face down and that's it. You use them once per game. But if you don't use them or you unflip them, then they'll be worth a victory point. And since we're talking about cards right now, if you're playing with the B side, you'll use these decree cards and you flip up one of these to start the game, and it basically like changes a rule in the game. So you can have kind of a different experience when you play it. Now there are some tiles and actions that will change that rule. They're not too many, but this can happen that the sort of the special ability for the game or the kind of the overarching rule change could get changed during the game. Now, in addition to any victory points you might have collected during the course of the game, which you can see here, you're going to score victory points for everything that you've built up over the course of the game. So the game's going to end in a couple of different ways, well, a lot of different ways. So if one of the flotillas or one of the cities fills up with all the buildings, all the spaces are filled up, then the game end will trigger. If one player has 1 building left on their player board, then that will trigger the end of the game. If you run out of supply of victory points, that will trigger the end of the game. And if you go far enough through the dive deck that gives you the resources, there's some special backed cards in there. You get far enough down, then once you start to see those, that will trigger the end of the game. And then again, you're going to score points based on the points you collected, where you built the buildings, those are going to give you points, the ports, and again, all the bonus scorings that I showed you there, and then the specialist cards that you haven't actually used are going to be worth points as well. So getting into kind of the 3 pillars of the reviews, obviously it's only a 2-player game, so there's no other player count to talk about. But the game time, I would say at most it would be a 45-minute game. That's probably like your first game. But then it would definitely, as I played it more, right at a half hour, even less. Not that I clock myself, but it feels like less. Because the game gets very, very snappy. It's like flip a card, resource, got it. Okay, now I'm building that. The back and forth becomes pretty, intuitive. And you can kind of see where people are going and stuff like that as you kind of figure things out. There is kind of like this strange like membrane strategic layer or something like that, where it feels kind of haphazard and random and sort of just, I'll build here, I'll take that special ability, da-da-da. Well, after you play it a little bit, then you start to see kind of the method behind the madness of it. And so as you start to see that, that'll incur a little bit of AP, I think. But again, the flow of it and the basic structure is so simple that it's really going to be snappy in about a half an hour. Now, as far as like what would I compare this to? Well, there's 2 games that I'm thinking of. And one is, of course, Flotilla, the kind of sister cousin game of it, which is a 3 to 5 player game. And this is only a 2-player game. You can't actually play Flotilla 2-player game, which makes sense. If you want to watch my review of Flotilla, definitely do that. But it really is only very similar in the sense of kind of the vibe and the theme. And I got to say, as far as the theme goes, this is much more detached from the theme. Flotilla I find really thematic and very interesting in that way. Whereas this is more of a puzzle kind of thing. But this is set in that same universe, but I could kind of take or leave the theme of it. It's a nice kind of window dressing to have, don't get me wrong. I'm not going to be a snob about the theme. But it just kind of fits in that universe. Now, the other thing that it has in common with Flotilla is the way that you can kind of mess with the supply and demand stuff. Now, it does it in a totally different way than Flotilla. Flotilla kind of has its own little world that it lives in terms of how the supply and demand kind of thing works, and you have this kind of flipping part of the game where you can go from the sea side to the sky side. Again, watch the review if that's not making any sense to you, but it's got its own very unique kind of way of doing it. And so does this. Now, I don't think they seem similar at all, but they just have a different approach to messing with kind of supply and demand stuff. So in that way, I can see how they're kind of related in a way. So I think it's okay that they use the theme in that way, because it's like, hey, let's try this other kind of way to mess with this kind of market mechanics. So that's pretty cool. The second game that this reminds me of is Cosmic Encounter Duel, which I also reviewed a couple of months ago. And that really only comes into play with the B-side tiles, and once you add in those kind of requisition cards, those special rules. So again, at the beginning of the game, when you're playing with the B-side tiles, you flip over a card, and that will change like some subtle rule. It's not some big like fluxy Cosmic Encounter kind of rule change. It's like, well, this type of action will give you a discount. Or if you do this, then you can get like victory points from doing this other action. There's a few things like that. And that rule can change a little bit over the course of the game, but that may or may not happen. You might just have that one rule, or you might change it once or twice and that kind of thing. And it's not like this whole big like shift, where it's like, oh, now the game's totally different. But I would say I recommend playing that way, but definitely not for your first time. Because even though the game is simple, you get resources or you build a building, all of those like special abilities and actions and the specialist cards and all that stuff kind of sort of mixes into the pot. So it is kind of a lot going on in some ways, but it's very easy to get the hang of. But I would say once you play it once or twice, you can throw those cards in there. There is the possibility that they'll change. And so, but that to me is going to make the game a lot more fresh and replayable and interesting. Because like I said, there's that membrane aspect, and this is the part I really like about the game. We have these two like competing threads, right? You have kind of a rush to kind of get your engine going, to get the buildings out quicker and kind of spit out resources when you shouldn't be getting them, that kind of thing, get your boats out there, all that kind of stuff. But then you have all of these kind of different ways that the game will end. So you've got to really watch what your opponent's doing, how kind of, nifty they're being with their strategy and their engine, and then really play around at the end of the game and kind of try to keep track of where everybody's at with the whole point scoring thing. Because I like that. It kind of pulls at a thread. It's not like a tug of war thing, but you have like these multiple threads kind of pulling you. It's like, well, if I do this, that's going to give me, set me up for some points. But if they build over here, that's going to end the game, or, this kind of thing. So I like how it has these kind of threads pulling at it. And you, again, kind of layered on top of that, you have all these little special, little bonus, little combo actions and specialist abilities, and like, oh, that's an ability. I've never seen that one before, because it's a decent little stack of cards in terms of the specialists and the rule change cards. So it's just going to make it that much more inviting to come back and revisit the space. So it's a really cool kind of game in a way, in a sense. So if that last few, paragraphs of sentences there, if you watch my review of Cosmic Encounter Duel, or anybody's review of it, you'll see that game is kind of the similar idea, with this real basic sort of core structure of, okay, I got these couple actions I can do, and these will get me points, or these will get me ships or whatever. But then you just pepper and sprinkle that with a whole bunch of little combo-y special ability things, and it's like you have to find the kind of threads through that to figure out what the most optimal decision is at that time. And it's very tactical in a lot of ways, and I would probably argue it seems like equally tactical and strategic, although I think it leans a little bit more on the tactical side if you want to get hung up on that. But yeah, I definitely recommend folks take a look at this. It's, like I said, kind of in the same world as Flotilla, which I really like, and I still have, obviously. And it's a kind of a different thing. So it doesn't really feel like Flotilla, the two-player game or anything, although the theme of it and whatnot is in that same universe. But again, the theme's a little bit detached, at least compared to how thematic I thought Flotilla was. But it's an interesting kind of exercise in that kind of two-player market space. But it, you know, has that nice... The thing I like about some of these WizKids games that they do is they do like Euro games, but they don't like, they're not stuck up about it or something, you know. They're not like really like crusty and curmudgeonly about it. They're like, oh, here's a Euro game, but then it's like, let's just dump all this, you know, this craziness into it, you know. And that's kind of an interesting thing, because Flotilla is kind of that same idea in some of the other games they've done. There's one game I didn't actually care for. It's like the space marketing one with like 7 players. Obviously I didn't really like it, but it was cool in that sense that it was like this really pure market driven thing, but it was like, let's just throw in all of these crazy special abilities. So that's kind of a nice breath of fresh air in a lot of ways. So this is a little bit smaller, more compact, tighter version of Flotilla in a way, but I don't want to like pretend like they're really that closely linked, other than they both kind of play with markets. So anyway, that's Seastead. Definitely take a look at it, give it a shot. I recommend it. Thanks.